instead of pursuing numbers, which is kind of what companies push us to do, if you can just reflect, to think about what puzzle are you setting out to solve? And then ask those 3 reflection questions as you solve the puzzle by saying, how well is it working? What have I learned? What am I going to do next? Just reflection and asking such questions and thinking about the puzzle will put you in a spot where you're creating the change that you want to create.
Welcome back, incubators. Today, I'm bringing you in on an amazing conversation I had with a woman named Radhika Dutt, who is the author of Radical Product Thinking, which is all about creating products that aren't just successful, but meaningful. And we talk about this obsession that we have, not just in companies, but as persons, with this drive to be the best and to hitting all the numbers. Radhika's first book was translated into Chinese and Japanese, and the method she teaches is used in over 40 countries. She talks about how the systems that we have designed for success can stifle curiosity and drain the very passion that drives real breakthroughs. There's so much goodness in this episode. We even got into dating apps and AI and all things of what's keeping us from a higher consciousness and getting in the way of being more human. And I found it really fascinating coming from a woman who went to MIT. She talks about how it was so curious to her that so many people weren't very curious. So pull up a chair, have a listen, and let us know how this episode resonates with you. Welcome to the show. I'd love for you to dive in because it's really fascinating to me how you are approaching what you do, and your world is very different than my world. You went to MIT, you're in engineering, like I can hardly add. So start just by telling us about what you do and also why you do it.
Yeah. So my background is in engineering. I did electrical engineering. And right from the start, when we were still in college and I started my first company with a bunch of co-founders, I always felt like, here I am, but I didn't quite feel like I fit in even in this company, right? Why is that? In hindsight, a lot of it was because I was the only woman among these co-founders. One of the co-founders, who is, by the way, now my husband, he and I had a very similar approach. We would question ourselves a lot, like, this doesn't intuitively sit right by us, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we would question ourselves, thinking, wow, I feel like I don't know enough about blah, blah, right? And I need to learn. Whereas the other co-founders, we're not in touch with any of them anymore. They were people who felt like, well, this is how things are done. They often had this mentality that we know everything. There wasn't any questioning. And this is something that I see often just in the corporate world, that leaders have to come at it from a position of knowing that I know and therefore I lead, and everyone else should follow me because I'm in the know. Right? And in fact, like now there's this fad called founder mode, where in the startup world, everyone talks about founder mode, where the idea is, as a founder, you are so close to why you started the company, understanding the problem, understanding customers. And therefore, as a founder, I know the most about business and I'm going to be intimately involved in all the details. And there's this sudden criticism that, the people who are managers and who might take the helm from a founder, that, these are people who are going to run your company to the ground. Delegation is pointless. Founder mode is the way to go. And I'm fascinated by that. It is basically this excuse for those who have not learned how to let go, those who are not able to question themselves, right? That we resort to talking about the greatness of founder mode.
That is surprising to me that is still going on at that level because there's so much data and everybody talking about delegation and teaching leaders how to delegate. I mean, I do that in part of my work. So this is surprising to me that founder mode is like reinventing something that it seems like trying to have been erased.
Yeah, you thought we had put this topic to bed a long time ago, but no, apparently not. No, see, I think what happens is there's often trouble in terms of delegation, right? When you want to delegate, how do you know that someone has enough skills, knowledge, and experience to succeed in taking over your delegation, right? And running with it. And what happens is sometimes we don't find the right balance. Sometimes we delegate when someone is not ready for it, Other times we don't delegate enough and we tend to micromanage. It is hard to find that balance, right? And I think when people have had a hard time finding this balance, this is where they resort to, oh, founder mode is the way to go. This is something that I noticed in a company that I was working at. I was working at Avid Technology, where it was a company that built products for video editing and for the entire ecosystem of you edit videos, the media to be able to manage that media, you needed stuff like storage, media asset management, etc. But it was basically a suite of products that was used in the movie industry as well as in broadcast, right? It's an industry that you really need to know really in depth to be able to figure out, what will my strategy be? What will I do next in the movie industry? What will I do next in broadcast? If you don't understand it well enough, how do you decide a strategy? So what happened at this company? The CEO and the rest of the leadership team had deep knowledge of the broadcast industry. And yes, they made some mistakes, but then the activist board came along, they threw out the leadership team, they put in a new group of people who had no clue about the broadcast industry. So what did they do? They focused on just the basics of business, which is how do I increase revenues and lower costs? Right? Mm-hmm. Let's do a bunch of layoffs. Let's increase revenues by, we'll put out this new product. Let's add these new features and upcharge, right? When you go back to these formulaic things, then other people will look at that and say, okay, founder mode is better.
Just to clarify, that's an example of like a backlash, right? Of this a black and white way that we seem to live in our whole lives and the government and society and everything. It's like, one thing didn't work, so we go swing all the way.
Exactly. Go all the way in the other direction. But there's one thing about this mentality, and which is, by the way, the main topic of our podcast today. But the mentality of the new management that came in was about chasing numbers, right? As opposed to the previous management team, they understood the puzzle of the broadcast industry. So chasing numbers versus the puzzle. And if you go back to the idea behind founder mode, it is that I want to focus on the puzzle as opposed to just chasing numbers. That should be how we think about it. But the answer doesn't lie in, I'm going to stop delegating. I'm going to just take this over. I know best. The question should be different. It is, we need to look at this as a puzzle. How do we understand this puzzle well enough, not just chase numbers? And how do we solve this puzzle? And how do I delegate this ability to solve pieces of the puzzle to different people, right? That is the key mindset shift and what helps us bring about this balance of delegation.
Okay, so what you're saying is it's not founder mode specifically that is the issue. It's that within the framework of this founder mode, we got this idea that I know everything and I can't delegate it at all.
Exactly.
Okay. So you're in school and you're doing all these things and you're like, this does not make sense. Everybody feels like they know everything and they're not allowed to be flexible. They're not allowed to be curious. And this just is not landing well with you.
Exactly. And for a long time, I thought maybe it's that these people are so confident because they know better, right? And it took me a while to realize, okay, this is just hubris. That it's not that they actually know. And that was my lesson early in life, in my early 20s, to say, okay, if something doesn't sit right by me, I am going to ask questions, not just sort of sit back and say, okay, someone knows better. So let's see, what did that lead me to? It helped me come up with this fearlessness in terms of saying, okay, I'm not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom when I see the need for it. Mm-hmm. It's not just for the sake of disrupting. It's not like that startup mentality, but it's this genuine approach to saying, okay, this doesn't sit right by me. I don't understand it. Why would this approach work, even if conventional wisdom says it should? So if you look at the first book that I wrote, which was Radical Product Thinking, it really takes this approach. And I'll give you an example of what was radical about it. In the book, I talk about what makes a good vision statement, right? And all through our careers, what we've learned as a good vision is something that's broad, aspirational, audacious, right? It's called a BHAG, or a big, hairy, audacious goal. Yeah. And what you need instead, I've realized, is not bullshit vision statements like to be the best in blah, blah, or to revolutionize something, or to disrupt something, or God forbid, to democratize something, right? What it is really a detailed problem statement, an understanding of who has this problem and why does it need to be solved, because maybe it doesn't. And then you can define what is the end state as you see it, meaning what does the world look like when you've solved this problem? And by the way, this is why Facebook's vision of open and connected makes no sense, because what does an open and connected world look like, right? And then finally, this is finally where you've earned the right to talk about your product. When you've defined the problem statement, why it needs to be solved, the end state, etc., then you can say, how are you going to bring it about with your product? And so a radical vision statement is a fill in the blank statement where you're not in love with your own words, where you're willing to look back at it and question it, a few months from now and say, are we still on the right track? And so here's a radical vision statement in a fill in the blanks format. And I'm going to share this vision for a startup that I had founded in 2011 and sold in 2014. Today, when amateur wine drinkers want to find wines that they're likely to like and learn about wine, they have to find attractive looking wine labels or find wines that are on sale at the store. This is unacceptable because it leads to so many disappointments, and it's hard to learn about wine in this way. We envision a world where finding wines you like is as easy as finding movies you like on Netflix. We're bringing about this world through a recommendations algorithm that matches wines to your taste and an operational setup that delivers these wines to your door. Now, the thing is, I hadn't told you anything about my startup. And yet, hopefully, after I shared this vision statement, you knew exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it. And so that is the power of a radical vision statement. And I guess just to come back to the beginning, what really stuck with me from engineering is that you can engineer the world that you want to bring about very systematically, as opposed to throw things at the wall and see what sticks, right? Which is kind of the traditional startup approach. But you can engineer the change that you want to bring about. But second, the idea is that we need a more human approach. It's not about chasing numbers. It's about thinking about what is the change we want to create in this world. And that really comes from deep within, by really soul searching and thinking about what is that change that I care enough to bring about in the world. And when we start to think in this way, everything feels a lot more satisfying.
So what is the change that you really want to bring about in this world?
I think that evolves over time. Right? I'll say that when I wrote Radical Product Thinking, the change that I wanted to bring about is that I wanted anyone who wants to create change be more thoughtful about what change. Don't create what I call digital pollution. And empowering them to be able to create that change very systematically. And if you ask me today, what is that change that I want to bring about? I'd say it is to have a deep personal impact, whether it's through my books or the personal interactions. But above all, the impact we have isn't defined by millions of people, etc. But it's the power of the change that we bring about. We can't possibly know that, but it's through the authenticity of being who we are and being thoughtful in what we're doing, how we're going about it, thoughtful in those interactions. I guess if I can bring it all down to being in touch with our humanity and who we are, I guess the thing that you really arrive at when you meditate a lot is that we are warmth, we are love, and to really be able to spread that through my work and in the interactions.
Yeah, and of course, this is why I got so excited when I met you.
It sounds like a long way from engineering, doesn't it?
It's a long way from engineering, but it's so fascinating because you're bringing it into this product level, which I just had not thought about before. And one of the things that I just wanted to reflect back is what I heard you say in this last piece was, at least part of it is, you want to leave people better than you met them at a fundamental level, right? Which I think is so valuable. And talking about doing that through being your authentic self and bringing meaning to something. And the idea of being the best, I think, is so perfect because that is how people will create a mission statement. We're going to be the best in this. And whenever I hear that, to me, I just hear someone who is being completely hijacked by their nervous system, by
Mm.
their conditioning that we've had coming up in this society and by their ego, which is
Mm.
not a bad thing. Like I've been there. I think whenever we are over identified with the thoughts in our mind and our nervous system noise, we all get there really, really easily. Speaking of Facebook, right? Like that's hilarious that's to be open and connected when you couldn't have more closed-minded things going on and less connection and more division,
Right.
right? And so to me, what drives that is this dysregulated nervous system and this over identification with the thoughts of our mind, or what we could say are our personalities or our egos, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, and our conditioning, our habits of conditioning of who we've been told we need to be. Like we grow up thinking you need to be the best, right? Like when I
Mm.
introduce you and say, you go to MIT, well, immediately, clearly you're much better than me. You're much smarter than me. You're more accomplished than me. That is how we are conditioned to think, you know?
What you said resonates so deeply because, this whole thing of to be the best, right? It creates a toxic drive. And I'll tell you sort of from my upbringing, just how this played into it. So from 1991 until 1995, I lived in South Africa, which you may recall, 1991 was when apartheid laws were abolished. 1995 was when the first democratic elections happened. So I lived in South Africa during momentous times.
Mm,
I was the first non-white in my class, the second in the whole school. So tough
wow.
times,
Yeah.
very racially segregated, right? And there was just so much of this feeling of the color of your skin mattered. You had to constantly prove yourself, right? And the feeling that it creates in you is you have to be the best to really prove yourself, right? And it's fascinating. For the longest time, it would create this sense in me of achievement. You constantly measure achievement in terms of, how far you're rising in the corporate ladder or what achievements you can talk about, whether it's humble brag on LinkedIn posts. We want to curate a life that is Instagram and LinkedIn worthy. And so that is the sort of toxic drive that being the best creates. And there was one point where I was thinking of accepting a full-time job, and my husband said to me, "Who do you have to prove something to and what?" And it hit me so deeply. It was true. Like, what was I trying to prove? And it really shifted my thinking. And it made me realize that it was this toxic drive of being the best that was still so within me. So how do you shift from that, right? So part of it is that soul searching in terms of forget this whole thing of being the best, but what do you truly enjoy doing?
What
And
makes you
and we
come
don't
alive, right?
what makes you come alive? That's right. And there is, of course, the piece about survival as well, right? So one thing that I thought a lot about at the time was this 2x2 axis. So think about this 2x2 axis where the y-axis is your personal vision. Now, this vision statement that I shared earlier, you can even write the same vision statement for yourself. Like, what is your personal vision? What is that? What is the change you want to bring about? And there was a point where the way I was answering this vision statement was I was saying that the today when it was really for my family, my nuclear family, that today they have all of these emotional needs, especially for my kids, etc. And if I'm not meeting those emotional needs, I foresee a long period of therapy that they're going to need. And why is this unacceptable? Because, that's not what I want to create in the world. I want to bring about people in this world who are well adjusted, who have secure attachments, who embrace all of themselves, right? And they can spread the same sort of joy in the rest of the world. That is the world I envision. And so, how am I going to bring that about? And my answer at the time was, I want to only take up roles that give me the mental and emotional bandwidth at home where I have Gandhi-like patience to devote to my kids, right? And so that was my vision statement. But in any case, the idea is define your vision in that sort
Yeah.
of detail. And it might be either a professional vision, it might be your personal vision, but think about what is this you truly want. And it takes time to answer this fill in the blank statement. What I described just now, it came out sounding really easy, but it was a lot of soul searching.
Well, and I also really want to, I always like to say this as well. It's like, it might have sounded like it comes out as, it also sounds like it is easy just because I defined it. That is not easy. Like, I grew up thinking I am not going to do what happened in my childhood at all. I am going to be the best mom. My kids are going to be completely emotionally cared for. And man, did that not happen. And it wasn't because I didn't have the intention with my brain,
Mhm.
but it's because of all of these things that create this unconscious way of us walking through the world. And so
Mm.
consciousness is something that has to be cultivated like on a moment to moment basis. And even when we do that, what I understand is that there is no arrival. We are
Mhm.
constantly falling asleep in this human system. So I like to say that because I think sometimes, particularly when we listen to podcasts and someone says something so brilliant and you're like, oh my God, they have the perfect family. They do everything just absolutely perfectly. And it's like, no, no, I don't care what any of us say.
Oh
We,
no,
we
I
fall
have plenty of
down.
regrets of my own.
Yeah, like it, and there's soul contracts, there's things that are happening for other reasons that aren't even ours, that happen with our kids and all this kind of stuff. But the point that you're making is that there's an intention, right? And there's an intention that you can continue to come back to even when things fall off the rails, and the gajillion times a day that maybe it does. It's like, but this is my intention. So I think it goes back to some of the crux of what you were saying is like, can I be curious? Can I make a mistake? Can I be wrong? Can I go back and say, I remember when I was training as a psychotherapist at Smith, I remember one of the things that they said in the very beginning was, listen, you can always go back. Like if you say something or you miss something, the next session you say, hey, you know what? I want to go back to this. I think I might have misunderstood you.
Hmm.
Right. So I love what you're saying. And I think that one of the things that I'd love to hear more about is you talk about puzzles and how you do that in a system, because I interview a lot of people who, we talk about how to help people understand the human mind and what's happening inside you and get yourself settled down so that you can actually implement what is coming to you intuitively, but what you do is you really look at the whole system and the products from that space, and you come at the same thing from a different door. And I'd love to hear what you're doing or what that means exactly.
I would love to get to that. So let's talk about that in just a moment. I just want to go back to the X and the Y axis for one
Sorry.
moment. So we talked about the Y axis, which is your long-term vision fit, right? There's the yin and yang of long-term versus short-term, because you got to earn a living and pay the bills. And so the X axis is what I call survival, right? And this is this question of how do you survive? So what's the survival risk that you have, right? And so when you start thinking about the quadrants that emerge as you look at this X and Y axis, things that are good for both your vision, your personal vision, and survival, well, those are the easy decisions. That's great, But it's not all that often that you're always doing things in that easy decisions quadrant. Or, it's not just easy decisions. I call it the soul surplus quadrant, right? It's both great for the vision and it's helping you survive. Like if you're doing a job that you love so much that it's, good for the vision and survival, I mean, good for you. That must feel really satisfying. But not all of us have found our way there yet, right?
Yeah.
And so the other quadrants are when it's not as good for the vision. So let's say you hate your job that you're at, but hey, it's paying the bills, right? So it's good for the short term. So what I find is that quadrant, like whatever activities you're spending in that quadrant, I call that soul debt. That's really what it is. So soul debt is where it's good for survival, but not good for the vision. And when you take on too much of this, right, you start to feel burnt out. The opposite of soul debt is body debt. So it's good for your long-term vision. So maybe it's caregiving. You really care about that. It's good for your long-term. But in the short term, it's not physically sustainable for you always to be in that caregiving mode. Right? So if you're doing way too much of this body debt, that also leads to burnout. And then I guess, then there's this quadrant where it's both bad for your long-term vision and it's not really sustainable, right? That's both body and soul debt. And that's the fast track to burnout. And so, going back to this question of, instead of being the best as you think about what is it that you want, you sort of have to balance the long term and the short term, the yin and yang. Think about how you're spending your time. What constitutes soul surplus for you? What constitutes soul debt? What constitutes body debt? And what's creating both body plus soul debt for you? And as you think about where you're spending your time and what you would like to do instead, that feels really empowering. That's one. But second, even if you have no choice, by the way, like, you might be caregiving for an older parent or whatever you're doing, even if you feel like you have no choice, you might find yourself just feeling a little bit better by identifying what is creating this burnout for you, by identifying these quadrants. So this is sort of the answer to the question we were talking about earlier in terms of how do you get in touch from a product angle to what is it that you want to do? What's the impact you want to create? Thinking about, your personal vision versus survival.
Thank you for bringing me back, even though I cut you off, which I didn't realize I was doing. That's
No,
brilliant.
not at all.
I love that.
But I love your question about curiosity, puzzles, how we go about that, right? And again, this is coming at it from the corporate angle and products, but also is a deeply personal thing. So let's talk about the corporate side. The way things work right now, we're constantly driven by goals, numbers. Here's what you have to achieve. And what I find often happens with this approach is it actually kills curiosity. And it sounds strange, but why is that? It's because when you set a goal or a target, what happens is you want to prove that you've achieved those goals and targets. You want to prove, ta-da, I've hit this number that you wanted. And so what we tend to do is we want to look only at the positives that prove that, look, here's progress. And we sort of sweep under the rug the negative numbers or like the negatives that are actually showing you things are not working, right? And so it dims curiosity because what you really need is you need to look at those bad numbers and say, what have we learned? And is this a problem? Is this an opportunity? You need to sort of pick at those bad numbers and figure this out with curiosity, with that openness, right? Whereas when we have goals and targets, we're not going at it with that level of curiosity and openness. It's, ta-da, I want to show you this. And so what do we need to do instead? And this is where this mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving comes in. Right? And we can even look at this at a personal level, not just in business, but I'll talk about both. Even in on the personal side, instead of just looking at it as goals and targets, right? Where if we just have goals in terms of, here's how far I want to get in the corporate ladder, being the best, which means, by the way, there's never enough. You always are reaching for the next rung, etc. So you could go at it in this way where you're not really looking at it with curiosity, or you sort of solve the puzzle of who am I? What is my vision, right? And what we talked about just now, this vision versus survival, is a way of thinking about what is that personal puzzle of mine? What creates soul debt for me? What creates soul surplus? What creates body debt for me, right? These are very individual and personal questions that we can approach with curiosity. In the corporate world, this might mean that, even if you're dealing with sales targets, right? Where instead of just a goal that you have to hit X dollars in X millions in sales targets, you could look at it as a puzzle. And by the way, that makes work so much more satisfying. You could look at it as a puzzle and say, okay, we want to get to X million, but what's the puzzle? The puzzle may be that maybe sales grew in the last few years, but sales have stalled. And the puzzle is, what's happening? Is it that maybe we were talking to early adopters, but our message isn't resonating for the mass market? Is it that maybe where the decision makers in the mass market are different from the early adopters, that, we need to sell to them differently? It's a different thing that we've just not known about. Maybe that's a whole puzzle to be solved there. So I define the puzzle, and now instead of just hitting sales targets or missing them, but not knowing what I do differently, I define puzzles, and then I approach it with curiosity. And in this framework that I'm writing about in this next book is the following three questions. 1, how well did it work? So I try something and I'm looking at the good and the bad and saying, how well did it work, right? The second question is I say, what did I learn from this? And here, I'm not just spitting out numbers, I'm really describing the narrative that brings in creative problem solving, like when we tell stories as opposed to just numbers. And then the last question, based on how well it worked and what did I learn, what will I try next? Right? And so we can use this for puzzle solving and build that muscle so that we learn how to be curious every day in our work. And that makes work so much more satisfying.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's so brilliant because this idea of a puzzle, right, it's flexible. A puzzle's flexible and it opens up a completely different center of your brain. It opens up the right part of your brain where you're now more curious and collaborative and communicative and empathic and intuitive and all of these other things sort of flood out, where the way that we've been conditioned to just think about, well, I want to be the best. And to your point, I think it's so interesting because you set a number and then the mind and the body automatically, just because of the way the mammal machine works, not any other way, like then the mind is like, okay, I got a number, I'm going to move toward that number. And everybody gets completely inflexible and we get a very narrow focus on this number that we have to hit. And when we get that narrowly focused, we don't have access to those parts of our brain that could, instead of thinking for 12 hours about something, it actually could drop in meditation. We don't have the compassion for each other, and the listening skills. So it's such a brilliant and simple model that you bring.
Thank you. But what you said resonates so much for me because this narrowing of focus, right? It is something I see so often. In fact, there was a product manager I was talking to, and he was talking about this target that was set for his team, or a set of OKRs, or objectives and key results. But it's basically a set of numbers that was set for his team. And he told his team, wow, I love this approach of goals and targets because it makes it so clear. If it's not, he said, if it's not moving this target, we're not going to do it. And I was thinking to myself, wow, just imagine that narrow focus, right? Like all of a sudden, instead of looking at problems and opportunities in the business that I can solve for this, I can solve for that, and raising these up to management, and maybe there are priorities that you might decide not to solve for some of these, right? But instead of even talking about them, we're going to discard all of these because we know, all we have to do is focus on this. And if it's not moving the needle, don't do it.
And it's a perfect example of what I call sophisticated sleepwalking. You just like this, our mind just lulls us to sleep. And what you're talking about is like totally like raising consciousness, opening awareness instead of closing it. And, I've had clients in the past who the whole idea of KPIs just made them absolutely insane. We would have to have a whole meeting just before they went into their KPI meeting. And then a meeting after they got out of their KPI meeting. Because it felt so stressful, so devaluing. It created so much defensiveness and then an inability in the employees to be able to be curious or critically look at themselves. And really thinking about, because one of the things you mentioned that fits into the beginning of my model as well is radical self-honesty. Like not just being honest about what's going well, but what, and when I talk about it's about who am I being that is not measuring up to that, which you can't be if you're not at all curious.
Yes, so much in what you said is really worth unpacking. What you said about this defensiveness and the feeling of being evaluated and devalued, etc., right? So let's unpack that a little bit. Our focus in the corporate world is on performance evaluations, constantly ranking you, because in this corporate world, this whole idea of being the best is so toxically ingrained, right? And so I constantly want to evaluate, employees on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 5, who's a 5, who's a 4, who's a 3, etc., right? And why do we want to do that? If you ask a few whys, like why are we so keen on putting numbers on people? And if you ask a few whys, what I've landed on is, well, it's only if I know whether you're a 5 or a 3 that I can know that if we're going to do a round of layoffs, let's say the instruction is lay off the bottom 10%, then I know who should be the one to go, right?
Mm.
But imagine how devaluing this is as a way of working every day, where I'm constantly trying to figure out who's the bottom 10%. When you start to realize that this is really the reason we keep trying to put numbers on people, then this is like saying, I'm planning a trip. I'm planning a trip to Madrid. And my whole packing list for this trip is planning for a hospital stay. It's
Right.
like that ruins your trip, right? Yes, maybe you have to account for that possibility. And yes, I will buy health insurance for it, right? But you don't plan your entire trip based on this idea of a hospital stay. It completely ruins your trip. And so my point is, even when we think about this model, this focus of performance evaluation, we need to reconsider what would be a better model instead. And the answer to that is it's performance development, not performance
Mhm.
evaluation. So let's go back to those 3 questions I talked about, right? How well did it work? What have we learned? What are we going to try next? What I found is when you do one-on-ones with employees and people present honest information where you're getting a true sense of how well did it work, you can get a true sense of what have they learned from, what was working well, what was not. I
Yeah.
can see the depth of their learnings, the depth of their analysis, right? I can ask them a few questions so that I really get a sense of, have you dug
Mhm.
into this well enough? And I might be able to give them pointers. Have you considered that maybe, you were looking at this metric, but have you considered this possibility that this metric is looking good, but actually, here's what's happening under the hood? Then when they talk about what will we try next, this is where I can course correct too, where, I can say, okay, this thing that you want to try next, it is super risky. What if we try something slightly smaller that doesn't take us 6 months to develop? By doing this, I'm developing performance. I have a constant picture of how deeply someone is thinking, what they're planning on doing next. I can course correct. I can give them feedback. Whereas the more you make someone feel evaluated, the more defensive they feel. Just let's think about all of our performance review and how much time is wasted when you try to tell someone, you're great at doing this, but in our last meeting, this is what I noticed. I need you to do this differently. Or by doing this, I can see that you would improve performance in this particular way. Whatever feedback I'm sharing, the moment they feel evaluated because they know you're going to give me a 4 or a 3 based on this, they'll
Yeah.
start to get defensive. They'll say, well, but you're really misreading that last meeting, and here's the context of that last meeting. You didn't consider this, right? So it's all this defensiveness. Let's get rid of that defensiveness. Let's all be authentic. We're focusing on performance development. We're all on the same side. That's the biggest shift that happens when we go from goals and targets to puzzle setting and puzzle solving in this collaborative way.
So good. And it's so true because it just shuts all of that down. What you're speaking of is such a in fact, I think I even mentioned my take on it anyway in the trailer of why I wanted to do this is that it's really moving from, and follow me for a little here because it's a little bit of a loose association, but it's really moving from intellect to wisdom. And so
Mm.
when I was listening to you talk, I'm sitting there thinking about, well, this is exactly what AI can't do. You're talking about a leader with all of their years of wisdom, sitting down with someone and listening to what they're doing and critically thinking, and not even thinking, but like you just get it, right? Like if you've been leading in whatever your industry long enough is, you know what this looks and feels like. And so you can intuit what your employee is grasping and what they're not, and what the areas of learning are, right? And this is exactly why we need humans, why AI can't do that. I was just talking to my husband about this because I'm trying to work something out and I was using AI to sort of help me. And it's like, it's not getting the nuance. It keeps wanting to jump ahead to, do you want me to build this? No, no, no. What I need to capture something bigger. And I think that our whole society is so driven toward intellect and smarts that we have completely lost touch with our inner wisdom, or wisdom at all, at that for that matter.
Wow, this resonates so much too. And in fact, there's a really good friend of mine, Gaurav, who writes a lot about intellect versus wisdom, right? And how it relates to AI. One thing that really hits me when you talk about AI is just this feedback loop that I foresee in terms of what is happening in terms of commoditization of labor. So right now, there's this drive to use more AI so that we don't need humans. And then what happens then is we use more AI, as in people use more AI as well to supposedly improve productivity. But studies are showing that actually, the more we use AI, it's also creating de-skilling. So doctors who were using AI assist for detecting cancer in colonoscopies, 3 months later, their skills were getting eroded in detecting cancer when they weren't using AI, for example. There was a study at MIT that showed that in terms of creative writing, the more you started using AI, the less creative your writing was.
Yeah.
Right. And so the feedback loop basically goes like this, where we use more AI because companies are saying, we use this for productivity gains and use fewer humans. So then people start using more AI, they start to get de-skilled. So then that leads to more commoditization of labor because we are getting de-skilled. So then we start to use AI even more. And so it's this feedback loop. And so how do you break through this feedback loop? One of the biggest dangers that I see right now is that people often abdicate learning and adaptation to AI. And I'll talk about this in the corporate world, right? Where in chasing numbers, we're optimizing for numbers, but we're abdicating learning and adaptation. So if you're looking at, building a product, I can optimize my UI to maximize clicks on something by perhaps using AI to create my design to do that. But you might increase clicks on something, but you might have really missed out on the bigger picture, um, that maybe you're not creating a better product. An example of this, um, an example of what goes wrong, by the way, when we chase numbers instead of solving puzzles. I'll give you the example of dating, right? The online dating field has been ruined by chasing numbers. Why do I say that? So in 2013, Tinder launched and they introduced swipe left and swipe right. And that instantly increased user engagement, which is a super important metric, by the way. I, in no doubt, am saying it is a very important metric. Yes, if you have a high user engagement, you have a better chance of monetizing it. And so Tinder had fantastic numbers for user engagement. So what happened? Everyone else copied the swipe left and swipe right. Okay, Cupid, Bumble, etc. Everyone has a version of swipe left, swipe right. So what happened? Well, the more they gamified intimacy, the more it created a toxic dating environment where people weren't seeing each other as human anymore, right? I could just ghost anyone, not respond to someone, etc., right? So we were optimizing for numbers. Everyone had fantastic user engagement, but we had created a toxic dating environment. So what happened then? It turned out people were just burnt out from dating, from this toxic environment. There was this whole backlash and a movement of delete dating apps. There was this dating fatigue. And so the entire dating industry was in a slump because of that. And in fact, Bumble just recently laid off 30% of all of its staff.
Wow.
So my point is, just chasing numbers isn't enough, that we really have to take this curiosity-driven approach and solving puzzles. Don't abdicate learning to AI. Instead, you have to own this approach of experimentation, learning, and adaptation with puzzle solving. What they needed to do in dating was not just maximize that number in terms of how do we increase user engagement, right? AI can get good at that. That's the sort of stuff AI will be good at. What AI won't be good at is figuring out the puzzle of how can I make dating a better experience while also monetizing it.
So are you working with Bumble now? You should.
I'm not working in the dating app space, but let me give you an example of this puzzle solving, right? I've been thinking a lot about this and I wonder why they don't try this. One thing people complain a lot about is, hey, I send out messages on a dating app, but I never hear anything back. I just feel like I'm devalued, nobody cares, etc.
Yeah.
So what if dating apps made people recognize the importance of humanity, that there's a human on the other side, made it easier to perhaps send a response. And the response can be, no, thank you. Thanks, but just not the right fit for me right now. It can be really as simple as that, as opposed to zero responses. How can we increase
Mm.
this human touch in dating so that it doesn't feel toxic?
Oh, I love this. This is going to take me a while to digest this conversation because we could go in so many different directions right now. And I'm thinking about a podcast that I recorded last week around, how this even interfaces when you specifically think about dating. This is a complete tangent, so I'm just going to say it and then we're going to move on. But like we talked about masculine and femininity. And what I'm thinking right now is like when you intersect what you just said about dating app with the Me Too and toxic masculinity and what COVID did in schools and shut everybody down and all of these things. Like we are so messed up right now in terms of the dating world and men and women and what they want and whether they think they can achieve it and what is masculine and what is feminine and all that kind of stuff. And this just literally like opened up a whole nother thought that I hadn't even really thought of, this like feedback loop. And what you're talking about with AI, it's like making us dumber is basically what you're saying. It's
Yeah.
literally cognitive offloading, which I also talk about in the trailer of this podcast, and just
makes us dumber, but it's also much more insidious than that, right? Which is increasingly people are having relationships with AI.
right.
As if online dating wasn't toxic enough, now we're creating these relationships where people have close relationships with AI, and AI is always giving you validation,
Yeah.
telling you how amazing you are, etc. Right? You're not dealing with real relationships where you're having to work on yourself, introspect, and say, this is my issue. I need to. We're not teaching introspection anymore by having by having relationships with AI, which is always accommodating and you have no flaws, is the mentality of AI, right? There's just so much there that worries me about where we're going. And this is why it all comes back to how can we make things more human by being more thoughtful, both in our work and in our interactions. It's constantly figuring out the puzzles that we can solve as humans as opposed to what we can do with AI.
And it goes back to what you were saying, about being radically, self-honest, around like what went well, what didn't go well, like what did I do that didn't get to this number? What was our part in this and whatnot? One of the things I was going to ask you, we started out very early on talking about delegation, and you gave that as an example. And I'm kind of curious to how you help people with that. So let's say someone is not delegating, because this question that you raise is a one that I think people think too often. Well, that sounds great, but how do I know that this person is going to be able to do that? So what is your solve for that?
Yeah, such a great question. And this is something I've had to figure out for myself. Um, the solution I've landed on is, when I have one-on-ones with people, with my team, and they give me their answers to how well is this working? What have I learned? What will I try next? Then I get a good sense of their knowledge, skills, and experience. I
Mm.
learned this from Mike, this podcaster that I spoke with on his podcast. And I found it fascinating that he used to work in the military. And he was saying how, in the military, you don't have this attitude that this person is a 5, this person is a 3. The attitude is more, each person has a specific set of skills, knowledge, and experience, and someone else is elsewhere on the spectrum of skills, knowledge, and experience, right? And so the question is, how can I harness the most from every single person in the team? And
Mm.
that's the question that we need to ask in the corporate world. And the answer to that is, when I have a sense of knowledge, skills, and experience based on the answers to these questions, then I know how much I can delegate. So someone who I see is really good at puzzle solving, it comes intuitively to them. We're going to get up this learning curve really quickly in terms of puzzle solving, their ability to continuously solve bigger puzzles. I can hand them bigger problems and go off, do it. I'm going to delegate a lot more to them. Then there are other people you discover they need more hand holding. Maybe they don't have the right knowledge, but they have the skills. And so they might be in a new industry. So once they learn all of that knowledge of that industry, then they have the skills and experience to be able to really go with it. So I figure out where they are in terms of skills, knowledge, and experience through their answers. And then I know how much I can delegate and how much hand holding I need to do.
And where does intuition play into your model, do you think? Because you talk also about, instead of KPIs, it's three other things. And where does intuition play into all of this, or how does it play with it? Or, I don't know, speak to intuition a little bit.
Yeah, I think the entire idea of puzzles and solving puzzles, there's so much intuition built into that, right? Imagine you're solving a puzzle and someone asks you, why did you think to try that? I don't know. Like, it was intuition, right? At work, we don't really have a place for this intuition to come out. Very often, leadership, when they set goals, they're basically saying, these are the solutions. This is what I need you to do. You're in a role of execution. So where is that space to know what is that first thing I would try, right? And also, if I have more experience in a certain area, experience leads to intuition. And so the more, like, the intuition that I've built through hard lessons of 25 years is different from the intuition someone else has when they've just graduated from college and they're starting out as an intern. And I'm not devaluing that in any way. They might have an intuition for social media that I completely do not have, despite all of my experience. They will know maybe what is going to resonate for a certain sort of an audience, right? So there's different sorts of intuition. But my point is, this whole idea of setting puzzles and solving puzzles helps you exchange intuition, that we create space for it in those conversations where I can convey my intuition. When you're solving the problem, saying, this is what I learned and this is what I'm going to try next. If I have a lot more experience, I can share, here are some things that you may not have considered in terms of what you've learned, right? Like, there was someone on my team recently who was sharing numbers saying, 50% of our users are using this particular dashboard. And I took one glance at that and I was like, wait, but is that because they land on the dashboard? That's why the number is so high? Or is this because they are going to the dashboard from a different page? Like, how do you consider, what does that 50% number mean? Right. Yeah. And so when you have experience, you're able to ask those questions. But at the same time, you're also creating space for intuition for someone else, sort of get a sense of where's their intuition at, and you're able to develop intuition in your whole team. As a leader, the hardest thing is to convey intuition to people. What you've learned through experience is really hard to put into words. And this gives you scaffolding to be able to transfer some of that intuition to your team.
Yeah. And it just speaks to, again, like how far away we've gotten from it, because all of this chasing the best and chasing numbers is so antithetical to intuition, which in our culture feels too slow. I don't have time for that. When actually it's much, much faster than.
Much faster. That's right.
All of the workarounds.
It's so true. When you have an intuition for solving puzzles rather than, when I'm able to start just doing it because I have a sense for the puzzle, right? I've understood it enough. That is so much faster than this approach where you tell me in an abstract way, here are the numbers that you want to go after, right? There isn't space for intuition for being able to understand the puzzle. Like, understanding that puzzle becomes devalued to a large extent, right? Because you set numbers for me that let's say, for example, the way OKRs are set. What often happens is that the leader comes at this saying, okay, to be able to get to X amount of growth in users, we have to release this product and that by this date. Those might be, part of the KPIs that you're measured against, releasing these key features by the end of this year, right? But then where's the intuition part for understanding the market and then realizing, actually, this feature is not that important. It's not going to get us very much. It turns out this is what the user actually needs, and therefore we should be doing that in this other thing instead. That intuition is built from talking to the user, listening with openness and genuine curiosity. And then you suddenly realize, okay, the puzzle is the important part, not the numbers. And so you do the right thing. And that's what actually increases customer growth, customer loyalty, etc.
And it's exactly right back to sophisticated sleepwalking. You just walk right off a ledge. You go in the complete wrong direction, but you are focused there. So you're losing that completely. So I know you've got another book coming out, and you've had massive success with your first book. The method is used in over 40 countries and was translated into Chinese and Japanese. And you've got another really big book coming out. So I want to hear about that. But I also want to know, like, what is the one thing I always ask this to people, if you could just sort of shake the world? Because to me, just even as I listen to you talk and have this conversation, I'm like, oh my God, like all the categories in which we were going in the wrong direction, with all of this uprising of consciousness and all of the awareness that we are gaining, at least, the people that I interact with, because the people that I have on and who I teach and all this stuff, we are more and more narrow-minded as soon as you like step out into Facebook or step out anywhere with people who are just so divided and certain and cutting off any ability to say, well, wait a minute, is this thing that I just heard actually accurate? Is this actually real? But anyway, that's about me and what I want the world to know. What do you? What if you can shake the world and say, I just want you to know this one thing? What do you want people to walk away with after they hear this?
What I've realized is there are very few people out there who are actively malicious and say, like the villain in James Bond, they say, I'm going to do this to destroy the world, right? There are very few, if any, people out there who are setting out explicitly to do that.
I totally agree.
Most of us just accidentally sort of create things and then say, oh, whoops, that was unintended, right? And so the biggest thing that I've discovered, the way we can be thoughtful is by reflecting. That reflection is so important. There was an interview of Sam Altman on New York Times. And a year after he launched ChatGPT, he was asked, so what are your reflections? And you know what his answer was? He said, oh, it's been such a busy year. We really haven't had the time to reflect. I was thinking, oh my God, if he hasn't reflected from such a powerful position, what hope is there, right? So what I will say is, instead of pursuing numbers, which is kind of what companies push us to do, if you can just reflect, to think about what puzzle are you setting out to solve? And then ask those 3 reflection questions as you solve the puzzle by saying, how well is it working? What have I learned? What am I going to do next? Just reflection and asking such questions and thinking about the puzzle will put you in a spot where you're creating the change that you want to create. Just thinking about it as a puzzle, because to go back to what I was saying, nobody is out there to solve the puzzle of how am I going to destroy the world, right? People are out there to solve genuine things, but we just don't reflect on it. So then we sleepwalk, as you were saying, off the cliff. So that is the summary, I think, in terms of puzzle setting and puzzle solving as a way of reflection and using those 3 questions to reflect.
And I love what you say, because I couldn't agree with you more, that I don't think anybody wakes up thinking, I want to destroy the world. I mean, nobody wakes up thinking, you know what, I want to be a fall down, piss my pants drunk today. That's my goal. No one does that, right? We have lots of things contribute to that, but it's not that anybody is purely evil. And that's what the world does right now. It just makes everybody evil. And it's so destructive. So thank you for bringing that into your statement there. Tell people how they can get in touch with you and how you want people to interact with you.
Excellent. So I'll make a quick mention of the second book that I'm working on. It's work in progress, so it won't be out until the end of 2026 or early 2027. So everything that you heard about in terms of puzzle setting and puzzle solving, you can download the templates for free. It's on radicalproduct.com slash go to toolkits, and you'll find that it's called the OHL's toolkits, objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. So you can find that, and I'll share that link to the toolkit. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear about your experiences as you use this OHL's approach. And by the way, since I'm writing the book at the moment, if you use OHLs and you want to share your experiences, your story might just make it into the book as a case study. So you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn and share with me your experiences.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for being here, Radhika. I have a feeling we're going to see more of each other.
I am looking forward to that, Abby. Thanks so much for having me on.